The stamped condemnation landed with a sound like a closing lid. The accused tried to turn his head. A leather gag kept his jaw fixed. Suspicion drove the researcher forward. He had come to this courtroom believing verdicts might be argued, not nailed shut before a voice could rise. He stayed on his feet, sleeves dark with candle soot, letting the hush that the inquisitor demanded press against his ribs. An observer in the back muttered and was shushed. The occult researcher moved through that sound, eyes fixed on the brass seal. He had not arrived as a stranger to procedure. At 48, the researcher had spent nights bent over rotting folios and fingers ink, stained from copying marginalia. He wore scholarly robes under a long coat, a brass monocle hung at his chest, and a heavy signet ring cut into the flesh of his middle finger. He tilted his head to watch the inquisitor stamp again, and the small iron talisman at his belt brushed against the leather of his coat. That motion, an almost empty gesture, marked how suspicion translated into method. He catalogued, he tested, he tailed. He moved when others only felt. The presiding inquisitor did not speak in a voice that could be argued with. He intoned verdict like a ritual. Guilt is recorded, he said to the gathered court, and the court enforces what the record declares. The bailiff stepped forward and set a red wax disc on the fore, edge of a thick ledger. The accused struggled. The straps bit into his wrists. The researcher, who had come for testimony, heard the order and felt the first shift beneath his confidence. Determination pressing after suspicion. He lifted a hand toward his grimoire and then held it under his coat. After the session, when murmurs pushed like cold air through the vaulted exits, the researcher found the corridor with its stone ribs and the bailiff alone. Torches threw light in vertical bands. Dust hung in that light, granular and specific. The bailiff's voice was low. They will not speak. He said names and causes are inked before the benches open. Who signs the ink? The researcher asked. He moved his fingers along the seam of the coat. The brass monocle clicked against a button. The bailiff glanced over his shoulder, then pulled a face like someone trying to swallow a bitter herb. Ledger marks come sealed. The bailiff. An order comes in. A petition in a private hand. We bind a name. The hearing is for the people. Concrete facts replaced rumor in that corridor. Ledgers, sealed petitions, private hands. The researcher collected them like tools, placing each new item beside a new question. He kept his voice level and let the bailiff's evasions break against his steady line of questions. The touch of suspicion narrowed now into focused inquiry. He would test every claim. He the bailiff to point him toward the archives. The bailiff hesitated, then budged, dragging the researcher behind him down a side stair whose steps had been smoothed by many feet. The archive smelled of oil and mold. Shelves leaned as if from carrying too much time. A single candle on the scribe's table spat thin light. The scribe adopted the slow movements of someone who had ink in his blood. His fingers were stained to the second knuckle. You should not be here, the scribe. When the researcher pushed past that line, the scribe produced a folio wrapped in coarse linen and bound with a wax seal. He tapped the red wax with a nail. We do not open these easily, the scribe. He removed a quill from behind his ear in a gesture that read like a small defense. The researcher placed both gloved hands on the table and did not look away. I will show the inquisitor if you refuse, he said. I will show him the ledger and force a reading in public. The scribe's mouth tightened. You will be branded heretical for that, the scribe answered. Presiding inquisitor will say you sought to undermine the rights. He will not need evidence to do it. The researcher watched the scribe's knuckles whiten. The scribe's fear served as a second shift in feeling, doubt seeding into anxiety. The researcher set his jaw, and the room shrank to the candle and the ledger. They were interrupted by a footstep at the doorway. An old clerk entered, his coat patched, his spectacles fogged. He slid into place with the economy of someone who had learned when to speak. Quietly and late, they stamp because they believe the stamp carries authority, the clerk said. He lowered his voice until its edges grew gravel. You stamp a name, you tie it to an order. Men believe a stamped line more than a witness standing in court. Who taught this? Who wrote the pattern? The researcher asked. He leaned forward until the candle flame lit the scar along his cheek. "A magistrate," the clerk said. "But the way the seal is cut, old marks, older than any magistrate." The scribe swallowed. "There are margins with names that respond to private petitions." The ink on some pages matches hands that cross the cathedral with offerings tied to signatures. The old clerk's disclosure changed the shape of the researcher's aim. He understood now that the court's instrument was not just a ledger but a theology of inscription, a belief that the recorded word could override spoken testimony. He felt a third emotional move, clarity arriving after anxiety, tightening his hands on the folio cover. The researcher asked the clerk to show him a stamp. The clerk produced a small iron press, dull and black around the engraved sigil. He turned it in his palm like a man turning a coin he can no longer bear to spend. They had barely handled the press when the door opened, and the presiding inquisitor filled the threshold. He moved like someone born inside the architecture of power. His robes were a darker black than the archive shadows, rimmed with tarnished gold. "You consort with clerks and old men, researcher," he said without stepping forward. "This house will not indulge your prying, inquisitor," the researcher said. "The people deserve to know whether judgment precedes hearing." He spoke plainly, using names to shape argument. The inquisitor's eyes did not widen. "You would make doubt public, the inquisitor. You would call our order sacrilege." "The court protects the faithful." The presiding inquisitor moved his hand to a chain at his neck and tapped the pendant there in a slow, precise motion that functioned as a reminder. The court's symbols were as much instruments as the stamped wax. The tension snapped and reformed around the central ledger. The scribe withdrew a wrapped folio and, under pressure, peeled the linen back to reveal a heavy volume with a red seal sunk into its face. The scribe set it on the table and said, "Margins show names. Some petitions are unsigned. Some come as folded notes from wealthy houses. The ledger ties a name to a sentence." He substituted facts for accusation and let them settle. When the researcher peeled the seal and opened the folio, the candlelight revealed lists. Names were arranged beneath headings, and beside many names small notations named patrons, bribes, or whispers of private orders. A line read, "For the quieting of Bertram of Lowgate, per sealed petition. Private hand." Another margin read, "To settle the merchant house of Crane. Render verdict per enclosed." He read the ink like evidence in a case, and the lines moved him from clarity into alarm. The scholar's internal rhythm shifted. His lips thinned, and the air in his chest tightened in a physical reaction. He folded over a page that bore a sigil he knew, older lines etched inside the wax like a fossil. Back in the vaulted courtroom that night, the researcher forced himself before the assembled observers. He held the open folio so that the wick light cut the pages in stark relief. "This ledger shows sealed verdicts," he announced. "Names are bound before testimony, and private petitions decide public sentences." Voices rose. "Shame." Someone cried, "This is sorcery." Another shouted. The presiding inquisitor's face remained an even plane. He gestured to the bailiff. "Remove that book," he ordered, "and bring the man who raised it." The bailiff reached for the folio, and a young scribe lunged to shield the page with his forearms. A rapid exchange followed. "Hand it over," the bailiff barked. "Step back." The presiding inquisitor. "Scribe, you will speak for the court." "I will not betray the archive." The scribe replied. "Neither will you," the researcher said. "You will not let private hands decide law." The room erupted into a string of short lines. Commands, refusals, the scrape of sandals on stone. The researcher watched the bailiff jaw set, and then felt a hard press against his shoulder as men moved to seize him. The presiding inquisitor raised his voice to a different register. "Silence the man and his witness. Detain them for sacrilege." Rapidly, the court became a machine. Orders, the tightening of rope, the clatter of the seal box. A struggle broke near the bench, and the folio slid free. A scribe shoved the ledger into the researcher's hands with a quick gesture that was both rescue and betrayal. His eyes pleaded without words. The researcher tucked the folio beneath his coat and ran. He shoved past benches, his robes sweeping against splinters, and felt the heat of torchlight on his face. The bailiff pushed men after him. and the presiding inquisitor shouted for the door closed. In 3 sentences, sudden action, pursuit, and a shouted command, the court sealed its response by force. He bolted into the courtyard where stone cobbles gleamed with damp. Torches blazed high. A chase narrowed into alleys and the scrape of a pursuer's boots. Voices called his name to drag him back. He ducked into a narrow passage and heard someone shout that the researcher had been marked heretical. A smear campaign began as the scribe's mouth advanced in rumor. An order was made to print condemnation in the cathedral's public register. The chase ended when a hidden passage opened into a small, shuttered room. He collapsed and undid his coat. The folio was heavy, its linen damp with sweat. He opened to a page where a folding of handwriting repeated a sigil. The letters traced a line that curved and intersected, a cut older than the magistrate's hands. He realized the stamping system did not originate with this court. A new, sharper alarm rose in him. The ledger's provenance reached beyond local intrigue to an order older than the courthouse itself. This was the chapter's twist. Verdicts were not merely corrupted by patrons. The method of binding names to fate bore marks of an earlier institution. He heard shouting in the street below and understood the immediate stakes. The court would use its pulpit to rewrite his action into heresy. He forced himself to breathe and to catalogue instead of panic. He set a candle by the folio and read each margin aloud in low phrases, as if the act of naming would make the ink clearer. Bertram of Lowgate, private petition. He said, Crane House, render verdict per enclosed. Each spoken line ratified what his eyes already told him. There was a sudden knock at his door. He closed the folio and pushed it beneath a loose board. He wiped his hands on his coat and held his breath while more footsteps paced the corridor outside. A voice called, not loud but carrying, "Researcher, open." The presiding inquisitor requests your presence. He could have opened and faced accusation. He could have fled with the folio and gone to print the names in the market. He made a decision that altered everything. He did not open the door. The knock repeated, then ceased. He moved a small brass seal from his pocket and rolled it on the table to test its weight. The seal bore a different sigil from the folio's press, a clerical mark, older but distinct. He set his monocle on the bench, and when he lifted it the flame read the grooves in the leather binding differently. A map of ownership formed in his head. Scribe, bailiff, inquisitor, courts above them, and below them a pattern of stamping that outlived men. That mapping shifted his final emotion into cold resolve. He would not yet publish, he would verify. He would trace the older sigil. He pulled the folio from beneath the board and then, carefully, he slid it into his grimoire case. The candle guttered when a draught came through the shutters. It left sparks of light at the page edges. He took the folio to a locked chest in the corner and placed it inside. He closed the lid and turned the iron key twice, the movement exact and intentional. He sat down and wrote, with small, steady strokes, a short list of names he intended to follow in the morning. He wrote the bailiff's name, the scribe's name, the clerk's name, and the presiding inquisitor's name, each with a line for source and one for verification. Outside, the courtyard bells rang the hour and men shouted that the researcher had been arrested in absentia. A rumor had already been shaped. Inside, he placed his palm flat on the ledger's linen for a single measure, a concrete, tactile test that tied him to the folio. He felt the seam of the wax impressions under his fingertips. He did not allow himself to believe that the ledger alone could unmake a man. He understood with a precise H that a system that binds names in ink can make the world obey the ink's claim. The chapter resolved its immediate conflict. The researcher escaped with proof in hand, and the court's attempt to silence him became public within the city, but revealed a larger, unresolved danger. The stamping matched an older order. He closed the folio, pressed the wax weathered by 1,000 thumbs, and listened as a single knock sounded on the study door. He caught a scribe slamming a wax, sealed ledger onto a stone table at midnight, the seal leaving a clean ring before any voice could speak. Suspicion pushed him forward. Suspicion had been the guide since the first time he heard leather tied across a mouth. He moved without announcing himself, sleeves whispering on flagstone as the cloaked figure, Marius, snatched the ledger and set it down with a force that matched the sound he remembered from the earlier trial. The panic in the acolyte's face was immediate. Marius, the occult researcher, low and steady, and the name landed like a demand. He had come that night expecting to read manuscripts and to find slanted notes. He had not come for a confrontation. Yet within the first minutes the concrete stakes were visible. Sealed verdicts existed here before a single witness had spoken. The researcher's hands circled the leather of his grimoire. He tested his voice once, then stepped. "Stop," he said. "Stop that book." The scribe jerked. The acolyte Alara stepped back, fingers white around a lamp. They were in the monastery archive corridor, where the stones smelled of dust and wax. Lamps guttered in iron brackets. The researcher watched the ledger's black seal catch the lamplight. A sigil pressed hard enough to flatten ink on the adjacent page. He thought of the condemned man's jaw locked by leather from the previous hearing, an image he had carried from the courtroom into the corridor. That image tightened his movements. He moved to block the table. "You should not be here, Marius." His voice was thin, a rasp born of late hours and deliberate secrecy. He was not young. He smelled of ink and boiled leather. "The ledger is not for outsiders. Leave." The tone carried a flat threat. Alara's lips trembled. "Please," she said. "Please, sir." She did not finish. Her hands found the ledger's spine as if she could steady it. The researcher saw the tremor in her wrist, the way she kept glancing at the stairwell as if expecting someone else. He stepped closer, and his body tightened. He forced his questions into short sentences. "How often do you seal these?" he asked. "When is a name written?" He spoke as a man cataloguing evidence, not pleading. Suspicion had pushed him to this corridor, and it drove the questions now. Marius set his jaw. "When the magistrates instruct, when the ritual clause is invoked." "The ledger waits." He banged a palm on the ledger's cover. "You will not pry into orders. You will not bring trouble here." He reached under his cloak and placed a hand near a satchel. Alara flinched. The researcher noticed that she had ink on her fingertips, a small crescent of black that matched the imprint on the seal. He also noticed the way she kept her eyes down, how she swallowed and pressed the lamp closer to the ledger's face. He moved his hand toward the lamp to steady it. "Show me the name you just sealed," he said. Alara bit her lip. "I cannot," she began, then blinked. "Marius me not to. The seal binds the courtroom." "It is done before a voice is raised." Her voice broke into a whisper, and the researcher heard the ritual logic in the phrasing. A chain, a binding, a sentence that existed before a hearing. That statement shifted the researcher's posture from curiosity to urgency. He pressed for specifics. Who writes them? Who signs? Who orders the seals? Each question shortened his breath. Alara answered in stuttering lines. "Scribe Marius copies the lists. The seals come from the clerks, sometimes from Alden himself." She stopped and folded her hands. "Alden?" The researcher asked. "Senior Magistrate Alden. Marius, you know who he is." "You have no business pulling at the threads of magistrates." His voice hardened. The researcher felt the first small shift. Doubt to alarm. Doubt had been the undercurrent. Alarm now tightened his chest and sped his decisions. "If Alden's name is there," the researcher said, "then the practice is sanctioned at the top." He stepped to the table and placed his palm near the seal without touching it. The wax was still warm. A sound at the far end of the corridor pulled all three heads. Footsteps. Someone clearing their throat. The immediate external event, the arrival of patrolling monks, forced them to move. Alara grabbed the ledger, eyes wide. Marius pushed the ledger into his cloak. The researcher held back, letting the corridor swallow them into shadow as the monks' steps receded. They split. The researcher followed along the walls and found a narrow wooden door ajar, the side chapel vestibule the outline had named. He cornered Alara there and closed the door quietly. "Alara," he said, "tell me everything you know. Tell me how the sealed verdicts begin." He kept his voice even. He kept his hands open. She looked at him and then at the candle on the ledge. She inhaled and spoke in measured phrases, the words coming in short bursts. "We copy lists at night because the clerks cannot be seen. Marius stamps them. The seals are blessed with a short chant. The chant names the courtroom, the judge, and the cause. Once sealed, The name cannot be argued in court. They say it honors the tribunal's finality. She tapped the ledger with a finger as if it were hot. The researcher watched her throat work, noted the small, physical tells. The way her hands clenched the hem of her robe, the way she avoided mentioning times or places. He for a sample, and she produced, with trembling, a hurried copy she had made earlier and kept folded in the lining of her cloak. The paper smelled of lamp oil. They moved to the archive chamber next. The researcher pried open a back door and slipped inside. The archive smelled stronger. Mothballs, iron, old glue. Shelves rose like sleeping soldiers. He set the copied folio on a table and began to read aloud lines of names, stopping when a condemned entry flashed with a pre-written condemnation. Each time he read a name and a sentence, the feeling in his jaw tightened. He read until the list filled the table. Dozens of names, and beside many, the same pre-written verdict in tight hand. He did not notice Marius's return until the lamplight made the man's shoulder visible in the doorway. Marius moved in fast and hard, blocking the table. They bumped shoulders. "What are you doing?" Marius spat. The man was ready to fight for the ledger. The researcher did not back away. "You are sealing verdicts before the courtroom hears a word," he said. Marius's answer was a motion, his fist swept, trying to shove the researcher away. The researcher ducked and grabbed Marius's sleeve. A scuffle broke out. Hands on fabric, a lamp toppled. The light fell and the archive filled with the small, violent noises of a fight. A scuff, a gasp, the scrape of stones. "Stop!" Alara cried, her voice cut through. She interposed and wrapped her arms around Marius's chest. "Stop it, both of you." Her breath smelled of lamp oil and fear. The scuffle ended because she would not let it continue. They settled into breathing and measured threats. Marius pressed his palms on the ledger as if it were a living heart. "You think you can expose us? You think you can pull down the magistrates? Alden will not tolerate it." He named Alden with a tone that mixed fear and reverence. That night the researcher insisted on seeing a sealed page. He pushed Marius toward a low desk and forced him to lay the ledger open. Marius resisted, then relented, hands shaking. The researcher found a page with a marginal note in smaller hand, a ritual clause written in a cramped, looped script. He held the lantern close and read the formula aloud, and the words on the page clicked into uncompromising meaning. The wax sigil was not decorative. It was a legal instrument that triggered courtroom pronouncements when the judge read the ritual clause. The clause named the magistrate who authorized the seal, and at the margin in a thicker hand was Alden's name. The revelation hit like a physical blow. It was a clear twist. Suspicion had been a ghost until then. Now there was proof. The researcher felt his pulse stutter and then pump harder. The shift slid inside him. Alarm to cold clarity. He could no longer debate whether the system was corrupt. He had documentation connecting the ritual clauses to the man who wore the robes of authority. Marius's face lost color. "You cannot show this," he said. "If this page leaves the archive, I will be accused alongside you." His voice had become thin. "Alden will." He could not finish. The threat remained unspoken but present in the small motion of his jaw. Alara stepped forward and slid a paper toward the researcher. "I copied this. I can give you the folio. Take it, hide it. I will trade it for—" She looked at Marius for protection. She named a price with a voice that flattened into business. A copied folio for safety. The researcher considered the offer. A bargain now would mean relying on a trembling ally who had just shielded a man willing to fight. He put the copied folio into the pocket of his coat and felt the edge of the paper press into his palm. He could expose Alden immediately in the cloister procession, but he knew how rituals worked. Authority moved fast in public, and a magistrate could call upon tradition and spectacle to discredit a single accusation. He chose the fragile alliance and the copied folio. He accepted Elara's trade. She handed the folio with shaking fingers and a line of small, practical instructions. Where magistrates would gather for the dawn procession, what torchbearers always did, the timing of the bell. Her knowledge came from routine, not heroism. She spoke in tasks. The researcher filed each detail as if he were cataloging evidence for a quiet legal argument. Dawn found them near the procession corridor outside the cloister. Lanterns trimmed the passage. The researcher moved with Alara at his shoulder, the copied folio hidden beneath his coat. He could see the procession forming. Townsfolk torchlight, a condemned villager bound in simple rope, footsteps measured to the rhythm of judgment. The researcher felt a hand on his shoulder from behind. "You carry a candle wrong," a voice said. It was Marius. He had followed them. He smiled without warmth. "And you carry papers you cannot show." The researcher kept walking. The procession entered the outer stone courtyard beneath torchlight, exactly as Alara had described. The crowd clustered like blocks of dark shapes. The condemned villager moved with a slump that made the researcher's stomach clench. The magistrates stood on a raised dais. In the front, senior magistrate Alden was a pillar of robes and tarnished authority. He read the proceedings with the slow cadence of someone used to being obeyed. The researcher stepped forward. He drew the copied folio and held it so the parchment could be seen. "Look at this," he said, projecting his voice across the stone. He was a calm, scholarly presence, but now he used that tone as a weapon. "This ledger proves a verdict sealed before any hearing in this court. It names," he let the crowd see the page. Alden's eyes hardened. "You accuse me of a crime against the tribunal," he demanded. He raised his hand and men, at arms, shifted. "You stand in a place of judgment with stolen paper." He made the ritual claim that always worked. The defense of courtly order. His voice moved across the courtyard and gathered tone and ritual. Marius stepped up alongside the magistrate and pointed at the researcher. "He is an intruder. He seeks to undermine the tribunal. He is a disturber of peace." His words were quick and sharp. "Take him." Alden's expression hardened further, and he cast a glance at the ledger at his side. A clerk produced the original and, with a gesture, resealed it before the crowd. The sound of wax meeting leather echoed the closing of a lid. The crowd shifted. A murmur rose and was smothered when Alden's voice boomed. "This man brings slander. He will be searched. If he carries false papers, let them be burned. If he errs, let the tribunal decide." His tone had become ritual itself. He had turned exposure into an accusation. The researcher stepped forward and held the copied folio higher. "Read the clause," he said to the crowd. Read the marginal note that names Alden. Read that it binds the courtroom to a sealed decision. He watched the magistrate's eyes narrow. Read it and decide if a man deserves a chance to speak. He kept his limbs steady. His voice did not shake. Alden looked at the ledger and then at the researcher. He did not read the clause aloud. Instead, he invoked custom and spectacle. A sudden bell, the folding of a banner, a group of ushers who stepped in to form a ring. The researcher found his hands grabbed from behind. Men seized him with practiced motion. The crowd saw the seizure and turned their attention the way a flock turns. In 70 heartbeats, the original ledger was reclaimed and resealed. The public ritual closed like a trap. "Seize him!" Alden ordered. The men moved. In 2 quick motions, the researcher was pressed against cold stone. Rope bit into his wrists. The condemned villager shied and was forced forward. The researcher met Alden's eyes without pleading. Alden issued a few words of ritual condemnation, then set the matter into the mechanics of tribunal procedure. The crowd dispersed with a dull obedience that the researcher catalogued silently. Acolyte Alara slipped into the press and touched his sleeve. "I did not mean," she whispered. Her voice was thin and practical, full of items. Where the ledger went, who carried it, the way Alden always resealed the book before a crowd. She slid something into his hand. A folded scrap containing a single marginal note she had ripped from a copy. It smelled of oil and dust. "Hide it," she said. They hauled him away toward the cloister's inner rooms. He did not resist beyond the initial attempt to call for witnesses. Resistance would have turned into a spectacle he could not win. In the corridor, a guard shoved him through a small door and into a side stair. He felt the blow of Marius's elbow again as the scribe moved to intercept. The ledger's original left the courtyard like a small sealed corpse under Alden's arm. Everything that had been urgent turned violent. They held him briefly in a cell beneath the magistrate's rooms. He counted the time by the small noises. A dog barking in the distance, a lantern splash, the clink of a key. He felt bruises along his ribs and the raw edge of a rope burn on his wrists. He did not speak until someone opened the cell and pushed a bowl of stale broth with a hand that wore a signet ring. He stared at the ring and read the sigil, Alden's mark. The picture of the ritual clause came back to him with a new sting. The way's authority had been formalized. A window near the ceiling in the cell let in grey light. He thought of the attic alcove the outline had named, a place above the archive. When he escaped by means that were not clean, by choosing timing and risk, he climbed, half limping, into an attic that smelled of old straw and cold mortar. He pressed his back to a beam and watched through a narrow slit as men carried the sealed ledger away on shoulders under torchlight. One of them was Marius. Another was a clerk he recognized. The researcher's hands trembled. Alara appeared in the attic moments later, hair damp from the early rain the night had promised. She climbed up with a loose step and sat opposite him. She breathed out a sound that was small and used only for utility. "They took it to Alden's chest room," she said. "They will put it in the private strongbox." "They always do." Her words were precise and task-driven. He folded the copied folio and tacked it into the inside of his coat. He felt the edge of the paper under his palm and the frayed margin of ink. He tested a plan with short phrases. "If Alden holds the original, then he controls what is proved. If the crowd saw me seized, they will accept his framing. If Marius cooperates, he will watch the ledger. We need an angle that forces a reading, not a spectacle." He listed possibilities like a man drawing up an inventory. Alara sharpened her voice with a small, practical suggestion. "If we can show a single clerk that he acted under direct command from Alden, he will confess. Clerks fear imprisonment more than ritual. They keep records." She spoke with the bluntness of someone who had handled keys and lists. "I can give names." She gave two. He felt a final shift, despair to hardened resolve. It was not the theatrical swell of destiny. It was a sober inventory of options and risks. He looked at Alara and saw that she had steadied. He saw Marius in his mind, the scribe who had attacked a man for a book. He thought of the condemned villager whose jaw had been bound. He counted his choices and folded them like a map. Footsteps approached above. He put the copied folio into his palm and slid it further into his coat. He cut the candle and held it between his knees to avoid the smoke. He could hear the ledger's carriers reach the outer gate. Their voices carried faintly through the eaves. He heard Marius's muttered oath at the courtyard gate. Alara pressed her forehead to the beam and whispered a list of times. Where Alden kept the key, when the clerk slept, when the gate would be lightest. He breathed through the pain in his ribs and flexed his fingers. He felt the paper's folded edge against his skin. He had proof in a copy, he had a clerk's name, and he had a trembling acolyte who would trade a folio for protection. Those were the concrete items he would use to press the hidden ritual network. The ledger itself was already gone. He counted the beat of a footstep on the stair below, and then another. Someone knocked at the attic hatch with a short, official rap. He tightened his grip on the folio. Alara froze and met his eyes. He slid the paper deeper into his coat and swallowed. The knock repeated, sharp and measured. He rose, extinguished the candle between his fingers, and set the frayed edge of the paper against his chest. He shifted his weight toward the hatch and listened as the footsteps paused. The chapter closed with that single, audible decision. He would not let the ledger's leaving be the last act. He pulled the attic door open a crack as hands on the other side reached for the latch. A torch flared as the judge raised the sealed stamp. The researcher lunged for the ledger and was shoved back before he could speak. Suspicion had driven him into the courtyard, suspicion born of a slammed ledger and a gagged man he had seen the night before. He landed on his heels, robes dusting stone, and watched the judge press the brass. The congregation fell quiet. That single action announced the central problem. The court sealed verdicts before defense could speak, and the researcher had come to prove it by force. He had been 48 when he first began cataloging these precincts, and he still wore the same long coat over scholarly robes, the signet ring fixed to his right hand, a brass monocle in his pocket. He moved through the courtyard with that measured gait he used when inspecting a fragile page, deliberate, unhurried, refusing to give the wardens reason to seize him. He had read the ledger slamming incident 3 nights earlier in the scriptorium. He had watched a scribe slam a wax, sealed ledger onto a stone table at midnight, and the sound had lodged in his chest like a bell. Tonight his suspicion pushed him forward again, because the sound had not been incidental. It was the mechanism. He kept a shadow near the outer arch and watched the judge set the stamp on the days. The condemned stood bound, rope biting his wrists, head lowered. A jailer held the rope taut. A scribe hovered with a stub of wax, like a priest with consecrated bread. The researcher's jaw tightened. He wanted to shout that the ledger was false, that names were pre-inscribed. He wanted to name the scribe and the seal, maker and demand the papers. Instead he took a breath and counted the ritual's moves. Footsteps behind him told him the novice had returned to the cloister. He stepped into a narrow passage and followed the sound. The cloister smelled of damp stone and old ink. He kept his hand on the leather grimoire at his belt, small comfort, heavy in the jaw, locked world he moved through. He eased close to a shuttered window and watched a candle throw the scribe's face into a hard profile. "You know why the seal matters," the scribe said, his voice low and flat. "Because it ends argument," the brother answered. "It gives certainty where doubt would fester." The researcher heard both names, scribe and brother. He moved closer, feeling the tension shift from suspicion to a colder certainty. He had guessed the ledger was a tool. Now he heard them call it law. He kept listening until the brother left. The scribe did not notice the narrow folds of paper dropped behind a loose flagstone. The researcher crouched, palmed the stone free, and with a finger-tip sweep, brought the folded note into view. The handwriting was cramped and hurried. He read 3 lines, a list of names, a marginal mark, a note that a certain sigil had been retouched. The sigil line changed everything. It implied someone had altered the binding that made the seal irrevocable. The researcher felt a new shift, suspicion becoming dread. He did not run back to the courtyard. He moved instead to the ledger chamber, where ledgers leaned like sleeping things. The door opened with a sound down the spine. The scribe started, then closed his mouth when he saw the researcher. "Why are you here?" the scribe asked. He rubbed his hands until the ink on his knuckles flaked. "Because the seal is a performance," the researcher said. He kept his voice low. "I saw the ledger slammed. I followed the mark." "Scribe," the researcher said, naming him directly to keep control of the exchange. "Show me the page with the new imprint." The scribe's eyes darted. He had a voice that tightened on each consonant, the vowels thin from habit. "You should not be in here, researcher. You should not be looking." The researcher stepped toward the shelf and ran his fingers along leather spines until he found the ledger with a fresh, smelling spine. He pulled it free. The scribe reached for it. "Keep your hands off that," the scribe said. The researcher did not answer. He opened the ledger and turned pages until the light caught a row of names, written in a hurried, even hand. Margins bore the same cramped script as the folded note. A small line, an amendment, had been stitched into the margin. A series of names struck through and others added. That amendment read like a recipe, not a record. Someone had prepared verdicts. "Brother," the scribe blurted, "you are making trouble." "I am making truth," the researcher said. "This page shows names prepared before testimony." The scribe's face changed. He looked away. "You do not understand the purpose," he said. "This is how order is kept. The seal protects the people." The researcher's breath came in a controlled pace. He felt the third emotional shift, dread curdling into a fierce clarity. He closed the ledger with a slap. "Then show me where the sigil was altered," he said. The scribe reached under the desk and produced a small box of sealing implements. He set a wax circle on the table and tapped it. The researcher leaned, traced the faint scratch at the edge of the sealed impression. The scratch matched the notation in the folded note. "Who touches the sigil?" The researcher asked. The scribe's mouth thinned. "Only the judge." The ledger chamber's single lamp hummed as if to underscore the word. The researcher tucked the folded note into his coat. He left the scribe half speaking, full of excuses. He moved back toward the courtyard to confront the judge, to force an open word. Halfway through the cloister, a muffled cry rose like a stone underfoot. He froze, pressed his shoulder to the wall, and peered around the corner. The novice scurried toward him, breath sharp. "You must go now," the novice whispered, eyes wide. "They already know someone has been poking. The jailer's gone to fetch more torches." "What did you see?" the researcher asked. The novice fumbled a small scrap of parchment from his sleeve and pressed it into the researcher's palm. "This came loose from under the ledger last night," he said. "I meant to hide it. I could not bear the names." The researcher unfolded the scrap. It listed 5 names not yet spoken aloud and a note beside one. "Prepared, change if need." The line that followed read, "Reseal at ceremony." The neatness of the handwriting suggested it had been written by someone accustomed to authority. The researcher tucked the scrap into the grimoire and felt the dread sharpen into resolve. He now had proof that verdicts were prepared to be sealed in ceremony. He pushed out into the courtyard. The night had deepened. Torches scratched columns with light. The congregation leaned forward as if the stamp's weight might reveal a new secret. The judge raised the instrument again and turned toward the bound man. "You cannot stop this," the jailer said when the researcher stepped forward. "Jailer," the researcher said, using the man's name like a plea and a lever. "Let me speak." "You have no standing here," the jailer replied. He shoved the researcher back a step with the flat of his palm. Hands moved to seize the ledger. The researcher pushed back his shoulders and planted both feet. "You will hear this," he said. He put the ledger on the dais before the judge could close the seal. The judge's hand froze above the brass. For a moment the crowd held its breath. "Put that down," the judge said. His voice carried over the cold stone. He wore robes of layered black and crimson, a heavy signet at his throat. His tone was deliberate, slow, an authority accustomed to being obeyed. "Judge," the researcher said, "this ledger contains names prepared in advance that seal." He lifted the folded note, and the scrap was altered. The judge's face did not change. He cocked his head. "Who are you to make such an accusation?" he asked. "Name me what you will," the researcher said. "I am the man who followed a slammed ledger to your vault and found a marginal note that matches the seal's scratch." The judge's mouth tightened. "Scribe," he called. The scribe stepped forward, hands ink-stained, eyes narrow. "Scribe," the researcher said, "did you prepare these names before testimony?" The scribe swallowed. "No," he said. "No, judge. Tell the truth," the judge ordered. The scribe hesitated, fingers to his shirt. There were suggestions, there were notations. We were advised on prioritizing dangerous men. A murmur ran through the crowd. The researcher felt the shift in the air. The emotional tide moved from clarity to a brittle uncertainty among listeners. He pushed forward. "Who advised?" he demanded. "Brother," the scribe said, "an advisor from the convent. He recommended names be noted for swift resolution." "Brother," the judge said, "you deny counsel." "I counseled only for protection," the brother answered, stepping up. "I wrote notes for the scribe to consider. The seal is not forged. It is sanctified. You have heard the evidence," the judge intoned. "The court will proceed." The researcher felt his chance shrinking. He had to force the ledger open where everyone could see the inked amendments. He grabbed the ledger with both hands and ripped the cover back. A pair of hands, the jailer's, closed on his sleeve. "Let him go," the judge snapped. "Let me speak," the researcher said. He yanked his arm free. He thrust the page toward the judge. The congregation leaned in, and the torchlight picked up the blotches of wet ink. He pointed to the margin where names had been crossed and replaced. The judge placed his palm on the ledger and spoke a word no one in the stone ring answered. The jailer moved like a net and the novice pressed forward, eyes wet. "Do you deny the mark?" the researcher asked the judge. He wanted a confession, a slip of arrogance. The judge's finger traced the fresh seam where the seal would be pressed. "The mark binds what is already given," he said. "The court answers to higher certainty." "You say the seal binds truth," the researcher said. "But this margin shows names chosen before trial." A brother in the rear called out, "The ink is a record of counsel, not conclusion." "Then why the instruction to reseal at ceremony?" the researcher demanded. The judge's jaw tightened. "Order," he said. Order prevents greater harm. You will not speak for them, the researcher said, voice low and close enough that the judge had to look at him. You will not press brass into a ledger and call that justice when you have already written the verdict. The judge rose from the dais with the slow, controlled motion of someone used to closing arguments with ritual. You insult the office, he said. Do you deny forgery? The researcher asked. Enough, the judge said. He turned the seal over in his hands and flicked the wax with an unconcerned thumb. The court will proceed. At that, the jailer seized the ledger and slammed it closed. A blade of torchlight cut across the researcher's face. The novice tried to speak, and the jailer clapped a hand over his mouth. The judge tapped the seal on the wax, and the stamp left a clean ring. The congregation offered no help. Several guests shifted from anger to fear. The emotional course in the researcher sharpened again, clarity giving way to an urgent attempt at action. He lunged for the judge's wrist, and the jailer's elbow came down hard on his shoulder. Two men took him by the arms and dragged him out of the ring.
Stop!
The researcher shouted.
Look at the margin!
Look at the alterations. Hands pulled him backward. A fist hit the ledger and the page folded inward. A scuffle broke out. The jailer shoved the researcher toward the stair, and the novice tried to slip a small, folded note into the researcher's sleeve, but was caught by a brother who had been watching. The brother's face was blank. He said only, "You should not meddle." The researcher did not resist. He had anticipated resistance. He had not anticipated the speed with which the court would close ranks. They brought him to the vault entrance and took the ledger back into custody. He watched as the scribe sealed the ledger again with a fresh impression, pressing the brass down and leaving a new mark over the page. In the sudden quiet after the resealing, a sound cut across the courtyard, a scraping at the vault door. Someone had forced the lower latch. The jailer's head snapped up. For a breath, the researcher thought the novice had engineered a distraction. Instead, the vault's smaller hatch opened and a frightened hand pushed a small scrap of paper into a guard's palm. "Who is that?" The judge barked. "It is a note," the guard answered, voice thin. He read it in a loud voice and the words struck the circle. A sigil retouched by court scribe under counsel of Brother Marcus. A tremor ran through the assembly. The judge's face did not betray surprise. He folded his hands and said, read it aloud, the guard read. Names were spoken. The congregation stirred as if the words had weight. The researcher heard his heart beat with a rhythm that was all action. Step, reach, push. He lunged for the guard and the page. He caught only the guard's sleeve. The judge slammed his fist on the dais. "Remove him," he said. The jailer seized the novice and dragged him up to the dais by the collar. "Tell us where you found the note," the judge ordered. The novice's hands shook. He met the judge's eyes and said under the ledger, "I saw it fall." "I meant to hide it. You hid evidence," the judge asked. "I hid a list," the novice said. I thought you would listen." "Listen," the judge repeated. "Scribe, your explanation." The scribe stepped forward and his voice rose in a thin, hurried defense. "I acted under instruction." Brother Marcus advised caution. "I did not forge enough," the judge said. He set his gaze on the researcher. "You trespass on sacred order. You trespass on justice," the researcher shot back. "You preside over a theater where verdicts are prepared and theater becomes law." The brothers around the dais shuffled. One of them, Brother Marcus, moved forward now, his shoulders stiff. He had not yet spoken. The researcher had a final hope that a voice of conscience would break the circle. Brother Marcus looked at the judge, then at the scribe, then at the novice. "Marcus," the judge said, "you counseled. Speak." Marcus's fingers pressed into his robe. "I advised triage," he said. His voice was thin, measured. "There are dangerous men. I suggested a list for expedited review. I did not ask for forgery." "Who authorized the retouch?" the researcher demanded. There was silence. The judge moved his hand, and two guard hands closed around the researcher's upper arms. The researcher saw then that the ledger had been prepared to withstand exposure. Witnesses could be coerced, notes could be slipped, the seal could be reapplied. The court had built systems to absorb challenge. "You will be expelled from the precinct," the judge said. "You will speak no more of this." The researcher felt the last emotional shift, resolve curdling into resignation. He had exposed the mechanism, but the mechanism closed anyway. He had moved through suspicion to dread to clarity to desperate action. The court had answered with force. The jailer dragged him to the outer gate. The novice stumbled after them, head down. The scribe turned his back. "Take his notes," the jailer snapped. They stripped the researcher of the folded note and the scrap. The judge leaned forward and pressed the newly sealed stamp against the ledger one last time. The wax held the imprint like a bandage. The researcher watched the seal cool. He could feel the heat of the wax in his memory, as if it had been pressed against his palm and then removed. At the gate the guards set him on his feet and pointed to the road. The novice was led away under escort. The researcher grabbed the novice's wrist. "You will tell someone," he said. The novice looked at him. "Who will listen?" He whispered. His voice was small but steady. "I will go to the market. I will tell Thomas, the cooper, and he will tell his sister at the inn." "Will that save the names?" the researcher asked. The novice nodded. "It will make noise," he said. "It will not stop the seal tonight, but it will make it harder to pretend nothing happened." The researcher let go and walked through the gate. The jailer closed it behind him with a heavy bar. He did not look back when the iron scraped into place. Outside the precinct, the street smelled of horse sweat and tar. He steadied himself against the cool stone wall and forced air into his lungs. He still wore the signet ring and the monocle. He still had the memory of the ledger's margin and the scrap the novice had given him. He did not yet know how to undo the seal. He did know where to begin. Proof, public noise, and a chain of witness that could stand against forced authority. A cart clattered by and a market seller called prices for onions and salted fish. The everyday sounds flattened the courtyard's ritual into mere procedure. They also promised a path. The researcher pulled the small folded note from an inner pocket. The ink was smudged but legible. He tucked it into his coat and started toward the inn the novice had named. At the first corner a hand fell on his shoulder and a voice said, "Researcher, you must leave now." The jailer's whisper forced his feet to move. He did not resist. He stepped into the lane, then into the dark beyond the precinct lights. Behind him, a fresh seal glimmered on the ledger in the vault, and the judge's shadow passed once over the days. The gate closed with a definitive sound. The researcher walked on, feeling the seal's finality pressed into the precinct's chest. He would not let the ledger's names fade into wax and silence. He tightened his grip on the folded note and quickened his pace toward the inn, toward Thomas, toward anyone whose voice could multiply a single scrap into public reckoning. A watchman called the hour as he turned the corner. The researcher did not stop to listen. The final image he carried was the weight of the seal cooling on the ledger and the novice's small hand slipping away from his. The precinct had resealed the ledger and imposed exile by force. That was the concrete beat that closed the chapter. The gate clanged behind him, and the night swallowed the courthouse's light.